When the forum began, there was already an unspoken tension in the air. The crowd knew that the appearance of Ivanka Trump, alongside Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, would likely produce more than just polite conversation. Crockett had made her name in Washington as a sharp, unapologetic voice, someone who never hesitated to point out inequities and question the intentions of those she felt were insulated by power. Ivanka, on the other hand, carried a reputation shaped not only by her last name, but also by the unique path she had carved for herself in business, and later in her father's administration. The stage was set for two perspectives that rarely overlapped to meet head-on. As Crockett began to speak. Her delivery was steady, infused with her trademark energy. She raised the issue of privilege, who has it, how it shapes opportunities, and how it often leaves ordinary citizens struggling to be heard. Her words weren't vague. They had an edge that made the audience lean in closer. It's hard to understand the struggle, she said, when you've never had to worry about choosing between paying the electric bill or buying groceries. It's hard to truly feel the weight of inequality when the doors you walk through have always been open. While she never mentioned Ivanka by name in that moment, everyone in the room could connect the dots. The silence that followed was thick, as if the audience was waiting for the inevitable reaction. Ivanka took the microphone with a measured calm. She had heard similar criticisms before, but this time there was a personal sting in the way Crockett framed the issue. For many watching, the expectation was that she would either deflect or remain vague, leaning on safe phrases that avoided confrontation. Instead, she did something unexpected. She didn't deny her privilege. She didn't attempt to paint herself as someone who had endured struggles she hadn't. Instead, she reframed the entire discussion. "I won't pretend I haven't had advantages," she said, her voice carrying an even tone. "But the question isn't whether privilege exists. The question is what you choose to do with it." That reply marked the turning point of the exchange. Where Crockett had drawn a hard line between privilege and struggle, Ivanka positioned privilege as a responsibility. She went on to talk about her work in expanding job training programs and encouraging private businesses to invest in workers who might otherwise be overlooked. She mentioned initiatives aimed at supporting women entrepreneurs, many of whom came from disadvantaged backgrounds. She emphasized that using influence to remove barriers for others was not a was a duty. The room was divided, but attentive. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. Crockett, seated just a few feet away, listened intently, her expression sharp but thoughtful. The moment had turned into something more than a debate. It was a clash of lived experiences. Crockett spoke for those who felt constantly dismissed by leaders who had never walked in their shoes. Ivanka spoke for those who believed that influence, when wielded with purpose, could still be meaningful. Social media would later amplify these two perspectives, dissecting every word and gesture. Supporters of Crockett praised her for raising uncomfortable truths, for daring to challenge someone whose last name represented wealth and power. Supporters of Ivanka pointed to her composure and her willingness to acknowledge privilege rather than deny it, something not often seen in conversations. Both sides believed their champion had prevailed, and yet the larger significance was that both voices were heard in the same space, forcing a wider audience to grapple with questions they often avoided. The clash wasn't about who spoke louder, or who won the applause. It was about two fundamentally different visions of leadership. Crockett saw it as rooted in authenticity born of shared struggle. Ivanka framed it as the ability to use resources and access to open doors for others. Neither perspective was easily dismissed, and that was precisely why the exchange resonated so strongly. It forced people to confront their own privilege, about service, and about what it means to truly represent the people. When it was Ivanka Trump's turn to take the microphone, most of the audience expected a response that would either glide past the pointed remarks or soften them with vague language. After all, political figures often rely on safe phrases to avoid confrontation. The expectation in the room was clear. She would be diplomatic, perhaps even evasive, allowing the moment to pass without escalation. What no one anticipated was her choice to lean directly into the subject, neither defensive nor dismissive, but strikingly calm and firm. She began by addressing the broader conversation about privilege. "I recognize the life I was born into," she said without hesitation. "I don't deny that doors have opened for me that might not open for others. But I believe the real measure of leadership isn't whether you've faced hardship, it's whether you use your position to make life better for those who have." Her words carried a balance of acknowledgement and conviction that caught the audience off guard. Instead of the guarded posture many anticipated, she set a tone that suggested openness without apology. The response surprised not only the audience but also her counterpart, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had framed the earlier remarks with a sharp critique of privilege. Crockett had challenged the idea that someone from a world of wealth could ever truly empathize with ordinary Americans. Ivanka's words didn't erase the critique, but they disrupted the trajectory of the debate. By admitting what was obvious, her background, and then pivoting to what she viewed as her responsibility, she avoided the trap of defensiveness. The firmness in her voice added weight to her argument, signaling that she wasn't there to minimize the issue but to redefine its terms. Asterisk as she continued, Ivanka highlighted her involvement in initiatives such as workforce development and women's entrepreneurship programs. She spoke about visiting factories and meeting single mothers, striving to balance jobs and family responsibilities. She described efforts to connect businesses with underrepresented groups who lacked traditional access to capital. These examples weren't delivered in a boastful manner, but as evidence that privilege, when directed thoughtfully, could have tangible impact. Privilege doesn't disqualify action, she noted, it demands action. That single line drew murmurs from the audience, not because it silenced every critic, but because it reframed the narrative in real time. Asterisk the calm delivery was key. If her words had come across as defensive or dismissive, they would have been brushed aside as self-serving. Instead, the measured tone gave her reply an unexpected resonance. Crockett, listening closely, maintained her composure, but the room could sense the shift. What was expected to be a simple clash of accusations and rebuttals had turned into a layered conversation about responsibility, perspective, and the definition of service. Asterisk observers noted that Ivanka's approach was more striking precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the tension in Crockett's remarks. The Congresswoman had leaned into passion, challenging inequality with the fire that had made her a recognizable voice in Washington. Ivanka responded not with equal heat, but with steadiness, creating a balance that audiences rarely witness when two strong personalities share a stage. It wasn't about volume, it was about tone. The fact that she didn't flinch under the critique, but also didn't escalate the conflict, was what left many in the audience unsettled and impressed. Asterisk in the hours and days that followed, clips of Ivanka's response spread across news outlets and social media. Commentators debated whether her words were a genuine reflection of her values or a calculated performance. Yet even those critical of her acknowledged that she had handled the exchange differently than expected. They noted that the first of her reply was unusual in a climate where many public figures choose either silence or defensiveness when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Instead, Ivanka's willingness to admit privilege while insisting on its potential for good disrupted the conventional script. Asterisk for her supporters. The moment served as proof of her ability to remain composed under pressure. For skeptics, it was a reminder that even those born into influence can reshape a conversation by controlling its tone. Either way, the response had impact. It highlighted that sometimes what resonates most is not the argument itself, but how it is delivered. Calm, firm, and unexpected. Ivanka's reply reminded the nation that tone can be as influential as substance in shaping how words are received. Asterisk. The exchange between Ivanka Trump and Jasmine Crockett might have remained confined to the walls of the policy forum, if not for the speed of the digital age. Within hours, clips of the back and forth appeared on social media, news outlets, and countless blogs. The contrast between Crockett's fiery critique and Ivanka's calm, measured reply proved irresistible to an audience always hungry for moments of conflict. But what surprised many was how quickly the debate shifted from being about two individuals on stage to a larger national conversation about privilege, responsibility, and leadership. Asterisk on Twitter, hashtags tied to both women began trending simultaneously. Supporters of Crockett praised her for speaking boldly about issues of inequality and challenging what she described as an unfair advantage enjoyed by those born into wealth. They saw her as voicing frustrations that countless Americans felt, but rarely heard acknowledged on such a stage. Meanwhile, Ivanka's reply gained traction with a different audience. Her acknowledgement of privilege, coupled with the assertion that it created a responsibility to act, resonated with people who believed that influence could still be used for meaningful change. The clips were replayed, dissected, and reshaped across platforms, each side convinced their perspective had won the moment. Asterisk news outlets were quick to amplify the story. Some praised Crockett for holding a powerful figure accountable, while others highlighted Ivanka's composure under direct criticism. What became clear was that the event had struck a nerve. Privilege, often discussed in abstract terms, had been confronted directly in front of an audience and then reframed in real time. The nation wasn't just watching a clash between two women, it was being pulled into a broader dialogue about what it meant to serve in positions of power. Asterisk for many. The debate revealed how deeply divided the public remains on questions of leadership and authenticity. Crockett's remarks resonated with people who valued leaders with lived experiences of struggle. Those who could say, "I've been there." Ivanka's response appealed to those who believed leadership wasn't only about shared hardship, but about what one chose to do with the opportunities they had been given. Neither argument was easy to dismiss, which is why the debate continued to unfold long after the forum ended. Asterisk. Commentators on television roundtables added fuel to the discussion. Some argued that Ivanka's acknowledgement of privilege was refreshing in a political culture where denial or defensiveness is the norm. They noted that admitting advantage openly, without apology but with a call to responsibility, represented a different kind of rhetoric, one that demanded consideration even from critics. Others insisted that no matter how measured her words were, they could not substitute for lived experience. The tension between those two interpretations animated days of conversation, ordinary people, too, joined the debate in workplaces, family dinners, and online forums. A factory worker in Ohio might nod along with Crockett's point about leaders not understanding the everyday challenges of paying bills. A small business owner in Texas might share Ivanka's belief that influence, when applied purposefully, can still bridge gaps and create opportunities. In this way, the exchange became more than a headline. It became a mirror reflecting the country's own conflicting views about privilege and service. Even those who didn't follow politics closely found themselves engaged. Clips circulated not just on traditional news but also on TikTok and Instagram, where younger audiences dissected the tone, the body language, and the substance of each response. Some focused on the symbolism, one woman challenging the system with passion, the other redefining privilege with calm conviction. The juxtaposition was powerful enough to keep people talking, regardless of where they stood politically. In the midst of this, Ivanka's calmness was repeatedly highlighted. Commentators observed that had she reacted with defensiveness or attempted to dismiss Crockett's points, the narrative would have skewed against her. Instead, her composure created space for her words to resonate more deeply. The unexpected nature of her response, neither heated nor evasive, was what made the moment so viral. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it, that caught the nation's attention. The rapid spread of the exchange underscored a broader truth about public discourse in America. Debates don't remain confined to the room where they happen. They ripple outward, carried by social media and amplified by commentary, until they shape national conversations. This particular moment highlighted the tension between two visions of leadership, and because both voices carried weight, the dialogue that followed wasn't one-sided. It was messy, contentious, and far-reaching, exactly the kind of national debate that reveals how Americans continue to wrestle with questions of privilege, authenticity, and the responsibilities of power. The most lasting impact of the exchange between Ivanka Trump and Jasmine Crockett was not the sharpness of Crockett's critique or even the calmness of Ivanka's reply, but the way it laid bare two fundamentally different visions of what leadership in America should look like. On one side was Crockett, who argued that leaders could only represent the people if they had lived through the struggles most Americans face. On the other side was Ivanka, who insisted that privilege, far from being a disqualification, could be channeled into a force for opportunity and progress. The clash did not produce a clear winner, but it revealed how deeply divided the nation is over what true service means. Crockett's position rested on authenticity, rooted in hardship. She spoke passionately about growing up in circumstances far removed from wealth and power, framing her perspective as inseparable from the people she represents. To her, leadership demands not just empathy but experience, knowing what it feels like to juggle bills, to fight for access, to see doors closed rather than opened. This was the heart of her argument against figures like Ivanka, that no matter how sincere their intentions might be, they could never fully grasp the reality of ordinary citizens, because they had never lived it. Her fiery tone resonated with many who felt dismissed by a political system dominated by elites. Ivanka's perspective, however, challenged the notion that hardship was the only path to legitimate leadership. Her words carried the weight of someone who acknowledged her advantages openly, refusing to downplay them, but also refusing to accept that privilege stripped her of the ability to serve. She framed privilege as responsibility, something that required her to step into spaces where she could leverage her resources, connections, and visibility to remove barriers for others. By referencing initiatives she had championed, such as expanding opportunities for women entrepreneurs and promoting workforce development, she reinforced the argument that what mattered most was not where a leader came from, but what they chose to do with the tools available to them. The tension between these two visions sparked one of the most thought-provoking national conversations in recent memory. For many, Crockett's insistence on lived experience spoke to a longing for leaders who truly understood the struggles of everyday life. For others, Ivanka's belief in channeling privilege into service underscored the idea that leaders need not come from hardship to make meaningful contributions. They simply needed to direct their influence with intention. Neither side could dismiss the other entirely, because both carried truths that spoke to different segments of the American public. This clash highlighted an uncomfortable but unavoidable question. Should leadership be defined by shared struggle, or by the ability to create opportunities regardless of background? Crockett's approach suggested that authenticity comes from proximity to hardship, from standing shoulder to shoulder with those whose challenges mirror your own. Ivanka's approach suggested that authenticity could also come from using a platform responsibly, even if that platform was inherited rather than earned. The debate left Americans grappling with which vision better aligned with their expectations of service. What made Ivanka's words particularly striking was how she reframed the critique of privilege not as an attack to defend against, but as an opportunity to redefine the narrative. Instead of denying her circumstances, she leaned into them, saying in effect, yes, privilege exists, but it doesn't have to be wasted. That reframing did not erase the validity of Crockett's point, but it complicated it. It forced audiences to consider that perhaps leadership is not a single path, but a spectrum of approaches shaped by different experiences. Asterisk. The exchange also underscored the difficulty of bridging these two visions in a polarized society. Supporters of Crockett continued to insist that no amount of resources or programs could substitute for the understanding that comes from living with struggle. Supporters of Ivanka countered that dismissing those with privilege ignored the potential good that could come from redirecting influence. Neither camp was willing to concede, and that refusal to settle only made the conversation more enduring. Asterisk. In the weeks that followed, commentators noted that the moment represented more than just two women sparring on stage. It symbolized a broader reckoning with the meaning of service in America. Crockett's Fire and Ivanka's.com both revealed truths about what people expect from those in positions of authority. Some want leaders who reflect their lived experiences. Others want leaders who can leverage every advantage to deliver results. Both expectations are valid, but together they create a tension that has no easy resolution. Asterisk. The debate left an imprint not because it delivered a tidy answer, but because it spotlighted the ongoing struggle to define leadership in a nation as diverse and divided as America. Privilege versus struggle, access versus authenticity, responsibility versus lived experience. These are not questions that can be resolved in a single exchange. Yet the clash between Ivanka and Crockett ensured that those questions would not be ignored. By embodying two competing visions of service, they pushed the country into a deeper reflection on what it truly means to lead. As the dust settled after the clash between Ivanka Trump and Jasmine Crockett, what lingered was not just the memory of sharp words exchanged on stage, but the questions their debate left behind. The moment had captured the nation's attention, because it was more than a political argument. It was a reflection of the deep and unresolved tensions about privilege, authenticity, and leadership in America. Viewers saw two women, from two very different worlds, confronting each other not with scripted lines, but with convictions shaped by their experiences. That honesty, in itself, was rare enough to make people stop and think. Asterisk. For Crockett, the exchange reaffirmed her role as a voice for those who feel unseen and unheard by a system that often seems designed to exclude them. Her fiery critique channeled the frustrations of countless Americans who struggle daily with challenges leaders seldom acknowledge. She reminded the nation that leadership is not only about creating policy, but also about carrying the lived truth of those you represent. Her words struck a chord because they came from a place of shared struggle, and for many, that authenticity was a mark of legitimacy that cannot be manufactured. Asterisk. For Ivanka, the moment presented a different kind of opportunity. Instead of backing away or responding with defensiveness, she leaned into the critique and turned it on its head. By openly admitting her privilege and reframing it as responsibility, she forced audiences to consider another possibility, that leadership can also mean using inherited advantages to create pathways for others. Whether people agreed with her or not, her composure and tone stood out in a political landscape too often dominated by defensiveness or deflection. In that calm response, she demonstrated a form of leadership rooted not in denial, but in reframing. The reason this exchange spread so quickly and stayed in public conversation was because it tapped into an unresolved national dilemma. Americans are still trying to decide what qualities matter most in their leaders. Should authenticity come from lived struggle, or from how effectively one uses their platform to serve others? Should privilege be seen only as a barrier to empathy, or also as a tool that, if used responsibly, can bring about real change? Crockett and Ivanka gave voice to these competing visions, and neither could be dismissed outright. Asterisk. In the end, perhaps the most important outcome was not who won the debate, but the fact that it invited millions to reflect on what kind of leadership they value. The clash showed that America is not monolithic. Its citizens define service in different ways, shaped by their own experiences and expectations. Crockett's fire and Ivanka's composure illuminated two paths, and the truth is that the nation likely needs elements of both. It needs leaders who can speak from shared struggle, and it needs leaders who can leverage influence to create opportunities. Asterisk. What this moment revealed most of all was that leadership cannot be measured by a single standard. It is not just about where one comes from, nor only about what one chooses to do with advantage. It is about a complex balance of authenticity, responsibility, and action. The exchange between Ivanka and Crockett did not settle the debate, but it deepened it, ensuring that these questions will remain part of America's conversation.